Thank you, Tibor. I have decided to speak in English so that you could understand this, but the bad side of it is that I will have to read the text, so I hope it will not be too boring. Tibor has already given a better introduction than I could have, actually, but the intention of my contribution is only partly theoretical. The main intention is actually to contribute to a better understanding of our socialist project, i.e. the ultimate goals of our struggle. Since, as always, the means are derived from goals, it is important to have some picture of these long-term goals that, regardless, form a basis for socialist politics. As some of you have already maybe seen from the abstract, we can roughly divide the answers to the starting question, why socialism, in two broad groups. The first one goes something like this. It says that the productive forces are assumed to, or already have, overcome the relations of productions, so that the end of capitalism is inevitable. And secondly, the second group is that that socialists fight for what they fight because of moral sentiments, because we need to introduce a moral order in which the greedy capitalists will not take from the poor anymore, and where egotistical behavior will be abolished for the benefit of all. Of course, in a historical retrospective, we can see that these two groups are not necessarily divided, that these perspectives can overlap and have actually overlapped. Concerning the first perspective about the inevitability of capitalism's end, what is its outcome in terms of political work and political agency? It does not necessarily lead to a passive political attitude, although more often than not it has. We could say that the purpose of the socialist struggle is to push history a little bit, to speed up the guaranteed demise of the current mode of production, but basically historical processes will do the job themselves. As we all know, this idea has been criticized a lot, even since its first conceptualization in the 19th century, but even more in the 20th. But in a way, it got spontaneously resurrected, so to speak, although cloaked in different terms, when the last great crisis broke out in 2008. It's easy to remember all those outcries that this is the terminal crisis of capitalism, that it's not going to survive the crisis, and so on. Of course, it is not easy to resist such hopeful prognosis after all that we have seen and been through, even before the crisis. The lack of any positive program, positive vision of a post-capitalist future was only a symptom of the problem, in the sense that it said volumes about the issues of this standpoint. In any case, even if the old view, as we know it, of the Second International, with all its mechanism and determinism lost ground to severe and justified criticism from all sides of Marxist theory and beyond, similar ideas in a different form rose again, and to some degree are still present in the form described. But I think there is no need to elaborate further on what's wrong with this position, since I believe that we are mostly familiar with it, along with its historical and theoretical causes. Here it is only necessary to mention it and remind ourselves of the reasons why we cannot coherently, in a political sense, hold such a position. The main point can actually be summed up paradoxically via Rudolf Stammler, a conservative German legal philosopher, as he is paraphrased by Bukharin in his theory of historical materialism. He says, one of two things is true, says Stammler. Either socialism will come, like an eclipse of the sun, in which case there is no reason for effort, for struggle, for a party organization of the working class, etc. For no one would think of organizing a party to support an eclipse of the sun. For in organizing a party, in conducting the struggle, etc., you are admitting that it is possible that socialism may not come. Besides the end of the 20th century really existing socialism and the failures of those regimes that still remain, says enough about this supposed inevitability of socialism as a higher or necessary mode of production, as it was usually said. And then if we do admit that socialism may not come, that it is not a necessary outcome of history, and I think that this idea is very important today, that there is nothing guaranteed in our struggle, and that it may be lost. So yes, socialism may not come, and then we can perhaps find the basis for our politics, as some people usually do, in the second group of answers, actually in the moral group. The usual justifications of such a political position have already been brought forward. Before we go any further, it is important to have in mind that we are discussing this issue primarily on a theoretical level, i.e. whether the moral ground has anything to do with establishment of socialism. Is it a good basis for socialist politics, and what is its connection with the ultimate goals of such politics? From such a conclusion, it should flow that we should, in principle, exclude the use of moral concepts in political work as a primary focus, and or we can say propaganda. One of the main practical problems with this moral approach is that it seems not to have given a lot of tangible results, a lot of tangible effects. It seems that as if the moral approach appeals and makes sense to no one except those who use it. For example, we can hardly say that a line of, so to speak, pro-ecological argumentation that sounds something like "because poor planet Earth" will convince anybody that ecological policy is important. Likewise, the argument "because solidarity is nice and sublime, worthy of human beings" probably never convinced anyone of joining a trade union or a political organization. And the same goes with saying, and these are all familiar arguments, let's bring democracy into the workplace, the university, or the neighborhoods, without actually saying what are the benefits of that and why should anyone actually do it. So in this sense, stressing some principal concerns, so to speak, does not only complicate the issue, it also functions as a supplement to real political solutions to social problems, either by pure emphasis on moral reasons as such, or, which is more common, by stressing the individual need for more moral action. The darker side of this argumentation, which usually goes unnoticed, is that it ascribes blame for structural problems to personal failures. And it goes both ways. It can sound something like, we have heard that often, it's the fat cat's greediness that is to blame for the economic crisis, world hunger, and so on. But also, the other way around, it's your laziness, stupidity, blindness that causes all these pollution, exploitation, evil, etc. So this is one of the reasons why we should have doubts about using moral concept in politics, because it often really obscures not only the problems, but those efficient and effective political strategies that need to be undertaken in order to politically advance and get a few steps closer to some actual solution. Besides, the emphasis on moral action is largely a reflection of the lack of real solutions offered by the dominant political system and its proponents. Instead of actually formulating something that might sound as a solution, notwithstanding their, so we could say, false character, political platforms usually boil down to more hard work, more personal ambition, or to something like we need to change our mentality or our consciousness. The fact that it is mostly a reflection of the dominant ideological narrative and the effect of the withdrawal of collective social agents and institutions in the last couple of decades should be enough to pose a warning against using such political vocabulary and such political concepts. The specificity of socialist politics, its demands, its goals and means, do not allow for a moralist political horizon, which is not the case with other political positions. In short, the socialist project appeals to other interests and motives, to put it that way. Of course, the terms in which we couch our principles and demands are crucial, but that is beside the main point here. Another important point in close connection with this, we can say that those on the left who adhere to this perspective, this moral perspective, we can say that they might be usually guided by what Max Weber, the old class-conscious bourgeois as he calls himself, labeled the ethics of conviction. Although he uses this the distinction between the two ethics, the ethics of conviction and the ethics of responsibility, with different names in mind. Actually, some interpreters say that he used it to criticize the Marxists of the day. It might be useful here. The ethics of conviction is characterized with a blind faith in the consequences of our actions. No matter what we do or how we do it, in the end, all will be set right and there will be no unintended consequence. According to Weber, the function of this ethics is to keep the flame of conviction burning, as he says. Regardless of real consequences that follow from our actions, the conviction will not be endangered or brought into question. So if we only stick to our moral correctness, if we hold on to the real motives of our political engagement, everything will be supposedly resolved in our favor. On the other hand, the ethics of responsibility is predictably just the opposite. Our actions can have unintended consequences, contradicting some belief that underlies them. This should be very simple, but it's often easily overlooked. And the last question is, what happens with these moral sentiments, what happens with egoism, altruism, selflessness, in regards to socialism and in socialism. The answer should be quite obvious. If we must speak of this, then we can say that all modes of behavior, even these moral sentiments of individuality, so to speak, in the form in which they exist today, are modes specific to the socio-economic structure of capitalism and are shaped by its workings. So unless we presuppose that some of them are innate to us, and that positive sentiments are stifled by capitalism, which often happens with this argument, it is obvious that already at this general level, it does not represent a good foundation for socialist politics. We cannot really derive our goals and means to achieve them from altruism or some other sentiments. And Marx writes something similar in the German ideology. He says, quote, communism is quite incomprehensible to our saint, he talks about Max Stirner, predictably, because the communists do not oppose egoism to selflessness or selflessness to egoism, nor do they express this contradiction theoretically, either in its sentimental or in its high-flown ideological form. They rather demonstrate its material source, with which it disappears of itself. The communists do not preach morality at all, as Stirner does so extensively. They do not put to people the moral demand, love one another, do not be egoists, etc. On the contrary, they are very well aware that egoism, just as much as selflessness, is in definite circumstances a necessary form of the self-assertion of individuals. He then goes on to say that, quote, throughout history, the general interest is created by individuals who are defined as private persons. This contradiction is only a seeming one, because one side of it, what is called the general interest, is constantly being produced by the other side, private interest. So to conclude, not only are the forms of individuality specific to capitalism, but the contradiction between them, which is often presupposed, is only seeming, we can say so, and cannot be understood, let alone resolved, in a manner previously described. So far we have lost, so to speak, two playing fields. We have lost historical certainty, but we've also lost the moral high ground. So the question is, what are then the foundations for socialist politics? What would be the motivation, so to speak, for socialism? The idea that I propose here is not new, nor is it really very complex, but it might require a reiteration and a possible expansion. That is the idea of material interest. In an article for the Jacobin magazine, provocatively titled Toward a Selfish Left, author Evan Berger argues that there is an entirely different path forward for the left. It's high time to leave behind this idealistic kingdom of morality and rediscover the realm of self-interest. Now, as much as it can sound blasphemous that the left should rely on self-interest, I will try to show here that with some necessary modifications, that this is plausible and that in fact it is, as he claims, the only hope for our movement. I mean, I will try to be less dramatic, but I believe that the argument still stands. But before we go on, there is a problem we need to address first. We all know, and Tibor has mentioned that theories of mass culture, the theories of culture industry, or simply theories of consumerism, some of its origins can be found in the work of sociologists and to some degree in the Frankfurt School, although one should be careful to differentiate not only among the different authors of the school, but also among their original contributions and the various interpretations that came later. A classical representative of this trend in theory, and in Marxism in particular, which the left usually considers its own, is Herbert Marcuse. I suppose we're all familiar with the contributions of these theories, so I will just sum up what would be the main point. So in general, modern 20th century capitalism has developed new forms of subordination and control, which are now also realized through the cultural sphere, with the development of highly mechanized and technologically sophisticated means of mass communication, radio, TV, movies, or the internet today we might have. Coupled with the expansion of liberal democracy and a general entry of the masses into politics through universal voting rights and revolutions in some parts of the world, we now have mass culture, or as some other authors would argue, mass civilization, where the products of culture are not reserved only for the high society, but are available to ever greater numbers of ordinary people. So besides the domination and control practiced in the sphere of production, the relations of production, we now have control outside of it. In leisure time, in time that used to be dedicated to free activity, when the tired worker goes home and tries to get some rest. However, in modern capitalism, the control is maintained even then, precisely through the means of mass communication. So instead of calmly watching TV, listening to the radio, going to the movies and relaxing, unless the worker is a woman who has to do housework, away from the tedious work that his boss requires him to do, and finally having some time to develop his or her intellectual capacities, our worker is now controlled through endless commercials, stupid TV shows, and primitive, they would say, contents in general. Besides being unenlightening, perhaps, the story goes, they also succeed in alienating the worker and connecting the fulfillment of their needs with a constantly rising number of various commodities. In comparison, the medieval serf, as an example, after he finishes working for the Lord and subsequently for himself, or when the agricultural season is over in general, can choose, in a limited sense, what he wants to do with his spare time, although this choice is obviously limited by his socioeconomic condition. The general effect is that the entire masses of people today are drugged and or hypnotized into passivity, unable to perceive their real problems, amused with the content that the culture industry keeps producing. The conclusion is therefore clear. People, and the working classes in particular, have become only passive consumers instead of active agents ready and willing to fight. The ruling class keeps creating more and more of these cultural products in order to keep them drugged. Capitalism has achieved this by creating a large amount of so-called false needs. This is a central term, which it continues to create, but we will get back to that later. The rising wealth and income that we have seen in the 20th century only serves to keep them in check. So the main argument is present. If the working classes really are only passive consumers, then any scenario in which they can actually struggle and possibly win the fight is cancelled out. The endless production of new commodities and the all-encompassing consumption of these useless products will abolish their need and will to fight. Therefore, we can rely on their material interests, since it is inevitably corrupted right from the start. We can say, people don't want to fight for socialism, they only want to consume more, and then some more. Or, people are stupid, they don't have the critical consciousness needed to perceive the real interest. They can't see how the elites manipulate them while presenting this manipulation as a rise in the standard of living. Or we can hear more interesting statements. People can't see injustice because there are all these reality shows. The system just shoves them into their heads. They can't see the true nature of society because all they do is watch football games and keep rooting for their favorite teams instead of going out on the streets and fighting the 1%. The list is more or less endless, and we have already heard these arguments hundreds of times. And I believe there are several problems with this argument. In the first place, the skepticism towards what is called mass culture or popular culture has not historically originated from within Marxism or in critical theory. Actually, its origins can be found in conservative literary critics, such as perhaps Matthew Arnold, which were concerned with the effect modernization, urbanization, and industrialization will have on the finer aspects of culture. And there are striking similarities actually between their views and those proponents of the cultural industry theories whose arguments we so often hear. For example, Matthew Arnold claims that, quote, people have turned themselves to the material aspects too much, that they stopped reading books and forgot moral perfection. Another author claims that radio and movies have a function of passive diversion. In a word, they are meant to discourage people from thinking for themselves. The fact that these claims actually come from conservative authors who lament the fact that culture is not a thing of the minority that can truly see its virtues should be enough to remind us of what is actually behind these concerns. But we can put them aside. The conservative argument, which often finds its way into left debates, that people don't read enough, that they just watch TV, they only now care about the material aspects and so on, itself actually speaks of its true motives. One can really say that these authors were concerned about culture primarily because there was a new class in their time with its own cultural arrangements, living in separated suburbs, kept together in large industrial compounds. And this class was growing and developing a sense of itself and of its potential power, which was obviously a threat. Secondly, it seems, in a political sense, absurd to speak of growing consumerism and growing consumption in a moment when, for several decades, the living standard of the widest rate of the population has been in a decline. This is true of Western capitalism, but even more so of our post-socialist societies. It doesn't really make much sense to speak of this growth when consumption keeps falling and limits itself mostly to a necessary range of goods needed to get by. and even these are scarce during an average day of the working classes. Bourdieu describes this perfectly, labeling it the choice of the necessary in the distinction, where he writes that, quote, "The fundamental proposition that a habitus is a virtue made of necessity is never more clearly illustrated than in the case of the working classes, since necessity includes for them all that is usually meant by the word, that is, an inescapable deprivation of necessary goods. The specific effect of the taste for necessity, which never ceases to act, though unseen, is most clearly seen when it is in a sense operating out of phase, having survived the disappearance of the conditions which produced it. One sees examples in the behavior of some small craftsmen or businessmen who, as they themselves say, don't know how to spend the money they earned, or of junior clerical workers still attached to their peasant or working class roots, who get as much satisfaction from calculating how much they have saved by doing without a commodity or service as they would have got from the thing itself, but who actually cannot ever purchase it without a painful sense of wasting money." End quote. We can say that the critique of consumerism might have had sense in the post-war setting, which saw a surge in the standard of living and consumption in general, but after all the changes capitalism went through since, it becomes really hard to get this point across coherently and realistically. But at the same time, it remains as a question of how much actually the working classes themselves had been actually integrated into this wide consumption, even in the post-war epoch. For example, he wrote the distinction in 1979, and how much of this rise in consumption was actually a rise in the consumption on the part of the middle classes. The slight increase on the side of the working class that we might observe is almost unnoticeable in relation to the growth of wealth in general, and especially in comparison with the increase of the top layers' share of wealth and income in Western countries. Of course, this does not mean that the extensive commodification we have witnessed over the course of the last century, i.e. the significance of the commodity form as a social form specific only to capitalism, with all its social implications, is not important. But only that the degree of consumption, its quantitative amount, does not imply that people will get stupid and passive. This would imply that the old leftist motto, the worse it gets, the better, the less people have, the more they will be inclined to revolutionary politics, is true, which is almost always not the case. Even the existence of and the social effects of the commodity form cannot be reduced to this, and I do not believe that the true significance of the commodity form for capitalism is exhausted in these aforementioned points. But we should, in a sense, understand whence this frustration with inactivity came, and one of the reasons is that it came from the failures of the revolutions in the West. Besides the acceptance of the post-war New Deal politics and all that went with it, also demanded some kind of an explanation. And for some, the machine of the cultural industry was the obvious explanation. But however, as Alan Masons-Wood says, the problem is further complicated by the fact that these critics of bourgeois society and culture themselves belonged to that very particular kind of bourgeoisie, were steeped in its culture, and, dare I say, sometimes shared its contempt for the masses. So we arrive at the problem of passivity. Are people truly only passive consumers, passive recipients of what the media serve them, or what the system has to say? Is the general pessimism of some sections of the left, so often present, actually justified? I believe it isn't, and I believe there are plenty of proofs in the everyday experience. For example, one of the theoretical strains which unfortunately kept insisting on the active character of social action were the modern rational theories, the rational choice theories, or the theories which are embedded into the modern orthodox economics. Although there have been some exceptions, Marxists were usually left with this passive view, save for the revolutionary situations in which we witnessed the transformation from the class in itself to the class for itself, as the usual vocabulary would have it. However, we haven't had much accounts of how does this change happen. How does a passive worker, immersed in this wide consumption with an existence so defeated and pointless, so powerless, suddenly become a fully active political agent? Surely political engagement does most of the job, be it in a form of a party or a movement or not, but there has to be an underlying activity which resists actually this hypnosis effect. There has to be something before this revolutionary change, which actually finds its clearest and toughest expression in direct political activity. This one-dimensional view, we could say, could not capture the fact that not all of social activity is directly imposed by the powers that be. Let there be no doubt, the structure of a society dictates the typical forms of activity, practice, or behavior, and it puts constraints on what we can typically do and thus remain integrated in the usual processes of society. But what needs to be stressed here is actually, and what needs to be examined, is what is actually left over after, so to speak, the structures do their work. I.e., is there any space for something we might call autonomous practice, as practice to some degree independent from the structural coercion in all spheres of life. Before I go on, there are two possible conceptual uses of structure when we talk about its effects and significance. I mean, this is only a provisional difference. The narrow sense, in which it means the set of circumstances, relations, and material conditions which give birth to different social practices in different times and spaces, such as the mode of production, the concrete social formation, and so on. And the wider sense, in which it means the concrete pressures and constraints placed upon the subordinate groups and classes, the relations that limit what is possible, and determine concrete practices against the interests of the members of these classes, and which is more intensively engaged with domination and class power. Of course, often these two meanings converge and overlap, but it is necessary to distinguish between them here. Now, while it is plausible, and in most cases certainly true, that the lives of the majority of the working classes are strictly subordinated to these structural imperatives in the wider sense, both during their working hours, if there are any, and during their leisure time, these imperatives have influence inasmuch as the typical forms of practice are concerned, as was stated previously. There is a small leeway for this autonomous activity, which usually cannot be supervised or controlled, which finds itself narrowly escaping control. On the one hand, this space where we can maneuver with what we are given can be found in spheres of everyday life. And on the other, there are entire social islands, so to speak, where such direct control is impossible or at least very hard to enforce. Let us consider only examples of such resistant tactics in times of peace. That is, outside of political movements, open resistance, etc. In a world when things are going smooth. For example, some poor working-class suburbs in third-world countries are examples of entire areas where there is very little direct control by the authorities in power, where there are local rules and the inhabitants themselves are to some degree involved in deciding what goes on in the neighborhoods, or even the working-class suburbs of major cities in developed capitalist countries, such as, for example, suburbs of we are all famous with that, Baltimore or Chicago or some major American cities, as areas of lawlessness, where the gangs or other social groupings almost have their own power structures and operate independently of what we may call the normal function of the city. Of course, this is not to say that these areas are beyond capitalism or that they are in any sense free of its influence. This only means actually that the weight of the structures in the wider sense is uneven, that it is not the same everywhere, and that it depends on various circumstances. And of course, these spaces are constantly under the assault of the official, institutionalized power structures. There is always the effort to bring them into line and integrate them more successfully in the mainstream of society. And here is where the conceptual difference regarding structures matters. This very condition in which these areas find themselves, the circumstances their inhabitants live in, are the products of the structures understood in the narrow sense. The poor suburbs in third world countries, or the suburbs of American cities, or even some suburbs of Belgrade or other cities in our regions, are a necessary product of how capitalism works in all these instances, in concrete terms, but also in the sense in which they are products of those necessary aspects of the very logic of capitalism. But the flip side of that coin is that it creates problems. It creates these cracks and ruptures within its very own fabric, and then it backfires. It makes it more difficult for the ruling classes to smoothly go about their business. A different example may be numerous and famous accounts of those small-scale resistant tactics which workers develop in the workplaces, where we would expect that domination takes its fullest and most direct form, and they use these tactics in order to resist work discipline, to resist the authority of their bosses, and make some maneuvering space for themselves, or easier to get through the boredom and the weight of work. I believe we can see all these minuscule, very little and small conflicts everywhere, not only in the workplace, but in all spheres of social life. The point of these examples is not to say that we should find these tiny cracks within the everyday function of capitalism and label them as the only remaining place where we can engage in politics, or as some do, regard them as a basis to our politics since the time of movements and parties has passed, in order to try and build some kind of socialism within these spaces where people can live freely or whatever. It is not the case of, as we could say, of some post-Marxist currents, that there can be, can only be actually fragmented particular struggles within the cracks of capitalism. It is neither the case that we should see the light in countercultural movements which can create whatever they want to create in their own midst, as if that's really possible and as if it doesn't actually forget the millions of people outside of those movements. The point actually with these cases is to assess the possibilities that the structures do not completely determine the actions of individuals or groups, although they do so to a great degree, and actually to show that small conflicts and struggles within the sphere of what we may call everyday life serve as cases in which we can see the extent of the space which cannot be easily brought under control. Apart from production, which has been the traditional focus of Marxist theory, it is also interesting to examine what happens outside production. What is the nature of the conflicts that occur in leisure time, in the, if we accept it as being separate from work, plus that's the area where the theories of cultural industry claim that control and domination also occur. Although the border separating the two has become more porous in the last decades with the changes in production and the development of various work from home schemes and so on, work flexibility, we can still draw a thin line of separation among them. As a theoretical point of departure, it might be interesting to take Henri Lefebvre's critique of everyday life. Although he often takes the vocabulary of alienation and speaks of influences we could interpret as the dragging effect, there is more to his work, and it can be important for the point the point here. He writes that the discreteness of the elements of the everyday implies alienation, and perhaps at the same time a differentiation, certain fruitful contradictions. The character of leisure is contradictory, both in terms of itself and in relation to the everyday. Leisure embraces opposing possibilities and orientations, of which some tend to impoverish through passivity, while others are more enriching. So what does leisure look like? For Lefebvre, leisure must break with the everyday, or at least appear to do so, and not only as far as work is concerned, but also for day-to-day life. Thus, there is an increasing emphasis on leisure characterized as distraction. Rather than bringing any new worries, obligations, or necessities, leisure should offer liberation from worry and necessity. But he, unlike many others on the left, does not pass his judgment, so to speak, upon the masses, as he says, which are more concerned with those aspects of leisure which might offer distraction, entertainment, and repose, and which might compensate for the difficulties of everyday life. If we are to believe the subjective opinions revealed by surveys, that's an example he gives, this is as true for the workers as it is for the other social classes. The question is why? For him it is because the worker craves a sharp break with his work, a compensation. He looks for this in leisure, seen as entertainment or distraction. So it becomes clear where does this craving come from. It comes from the tediousness and coercion in production, among other things. Still, his criticism does not end where one might expect him to. He does not see the leisure and the everyday not only as a distraction. For him, this distraction is only an element in this set. Then he writes, if this were all there was, critique of everyday life would only bring the disappointing aspects of social praxis to the fore. It would emphasize the trivial and the repellent. If this were the only path it followed, it would be barely distinguishable from a certain branch of existentialism. The hypothesis of our study is rather different. It is in everyday life, and starting from everyday life, that genuine creations are achieved, which people produce as part of the process of becoming human, works of creativity. And lastly, and actually most importantly for the aim of this argument here, these superior creations are born from seeds constrained in everyday practice. From the moment groups or individuals are obliged to plan ahead, to organize their time, and to use whatever means they have at their disposal, reason is formed in social practice. As day follows trivial day, the eye learns how to see, the ear learns how to hear, the body learns how to keep to rhythms. So what we get here with Lefebvre, what we win in a conceptual sense, so to speak, is an idea of leisure as a dynamic space, as a continuum which contains contradictions and opposing possibilities, which is not only reduced to passive existence and daily drudging, and in which people can, to some extent, be creative and resist the trivial and the repellent. And from here we can go on and see how this develops. So what are then the consequences of these conclusions regarding mass popular culture? There is an example actually given by John Fiske in his understanding the popular when he speaks of the so-called proletarian shopping, which he uses to describe a specific activity of the younger unemployed proletarians. In a couple of words, since they have no money, but they have a lot of spare time, they would visit the shopping malls, but without actually buying anything. They would stand in front of the stores, preventing other people from getting in, provoking the owner or the security guards to come out and stop them. Or, since alcohol use was banned in those shopping malls he tells us about, they would fill their soda cans with alcohol, drinking it in front of the guards, which will then come and inspect whether it's really alcohol, only to find the boys actually drinking soda. Then he mentions, for example, thefts in shopping mall stores. He says that those thefts are not only, quote, an assault on the store owners as such, but on the power block itself. The store owners are not only in autonomy of their allies in power: parents, teachers, guards, the justice system, and all other agents of social discipline and repression. And finally, two examples that are interesting to mention. He mentions two research accounts on commercials and their influence. According to the first, 1,100 ads are daily thrown at an average Australian family, but people, when asked, can recall only 3 or 4 of them. The second account examined the degree of memorizing 8 popular commercial slogans among, in total, 300 younger women. The idea was to see whether the research subjects could attach a product name to a slogan, and the average score was only 6%. Of course, we cannot say that the advertising industry does not manage to get a hold of people and that it doesn't advance its causes. The question is, how efficient is it? And for him, commercials are only one force of such processes that is no less immune to subversion, avoidance, and resistance than any others. And I think that we can extend this to all other means, especially cultural. They are a force that is not immune to resistance, and moreover, it is possible to wage a silent struggle. He labels it a guerrilla war, since it is a fractious struggle against a much more powerful enemy, to try and overturn the products of the industry, to resist the official uses and plans, and to try to redirect what is attempted to be served into our own uses and goals. And we can see this in many products of popular culture. For example, pop songs which are written with one purpose, possibly as and this actually happens a lot, as a sarcastic critique of something, but at the end it serves another purpose. It's overtaken by the very social groups which were meant to be criticized, or for example, working class characters in popular TV shows which are meant to be derided as stupid or primitive, but then it happens that the working class viewers actually identify with them and thereby gain insight about their own situation and position. And these examples can be really countless. Every attempt to examine popular culture actually, in this way, finds itself on a slippery terrain, and there is always a danger to slip into this particularism and fragmentation type of politics. But the goal is not, here is not to say this is politics, this is enough, this is the only kind of politics we can engage today. This would be, in a way, the dark reverse side of capitalist triumphalism. The question that remains then, and this is the second important question, is the following. If the structural aspects do not determine all possible practice. And if the culture industry cannot exercise complete control and hypnosis, what then is the social basis? What are the grounds on which this resistance and creativity performed in opposition to the prevailing order, its logic, and the powers that be? One of the answers to that question can be that it is the material interest of the other side, i.e. of the working classes, which are in a more basic sense and on average conscious of their interests in class struggle. We could say even that they are essentially rational, not in the way the rationalist theory would have it, as hyper-rational individuals always measuring costs to benefits and seeing every social interaction in terms of market exchange, but more in the sense of being able to perceive what are their interests and what, and also what is in the way of realizing those interests. This does not imply the neoclassical model. The type of reason that this model presents and takes as universal is at best present among other forms of rationality and reasoning specific to capitalism and its contradictions. The error is in abstracting it from other modes of behavior and presenting it as truly human and the only one truly rational. Plus, it divorces people not only from the collective and super-individual social forms and organizations, but also from any wider social influences exerted by the structural moments. So yes, the attempt to conceptualize interest in non-rationalist and collective terms can and probably will be difficult, but it might be worth the effort if it can lead to some political results. The point is not to say that people never engage in such reasoning. The point is in emphasizing its historical character, but more importantly, in showing that material interest, or even self-interest, as is argued in the Jacobin article I mentioned, does not necessarily imply individualism and the rationalist type of rationality. And that it doesn't even have to have an individual premise at its basis. It can be, and most often it is, in harmony with group or collective interests. In other words, as we have seen from various examples and arguments so far, material interest can coexist with non-capitalist or anti-capitalist practices that resist and oppose the capitalist logic. This is an important point, and it deserves to be summed up. We can say that the working classes actually can operate, so to speak, autonomously and according to their interests, even in the most repressive and dominated conditions. Another point that is worth mentioning, that there is actually no difference between this opposition that goes on in the everyday, both in production and in leisure, and what we might call direct and open political activity. It is only a difference in degree. If we would try to measure the efficacy and the probability of success, we could construct an imaginary scale, so to speak, that will have everyday opposition and tactical resistance as its lowest point. They usually are not very efficient and don't lead to real and lasting success. And mass direct collective open political activity in terms of movements and organized political bodies as its highest point, since they usually in the abstract and in general present political forms most likely to lead to success. So it is not a matter of consciousness, and as if one simply can have it or not, and when we don't have it we are oblivious to everything. I don't think capitalism has ever succeeded in that sense. It is a matter of how efficient our political action is, how much can it truly strike at the right points and at the right times. And it naturally follows that these tactical practices, or whatever we choose to call them, score worst at this, which is another reason for why it is pointless to stick to them as genuine politics. And that all efforts of a socialist project should be aimed at raising the stakes, so to speak, at providing people the means to make the struggle have a wider, more relevant point, to channel their interest and their dissatisfaction from, as we have said, proletarian shopping, for example, or any of these other practices, to organize political activity which would further their interest at the expense of the dominant interest. The existence of such practices, which I have mentioned, only serve here to prove that we have a basis to build on, that people are not drugged or stupid or whatever, and that they are on average aware of what is better for them. So the socialist task, so to speak, would be then twofold. On the one hand, to explain why the working classes so often see their interests advanced in wrong political options, such as, for example, workers voting for Reagan in the 80s, which has happened, and on the other, to show that the workers and other possible allies cannot permanently realize their interests individually or to particular small-scale struggles, but only within a wider collective struggle. And this may be one of the more important lessons of class struggle, and that is the fact that the working classes act according to their material interests in the framework allowed by society's constraints, can clearly be observed in the following two examples. For example, the thing with Reagan, Robert and Johanna Brenner have this piece called Reagan, the Right and the Working Class. They write that quote, workers have moved right instead of left because of what they perceive to be and what in a limited but important sense really are their immediate short-run economic interests, however disastrous they may be in the long run. Another more recent example would be the elections held in Serbia a couple of weeks ago. The Serbian Progressive Party, a party that will most likely push through hardest neoliberal reforms since the overthrow of the Milosevic regime, got almost 50% of the vote. On the other hand, the parties of the traditional right have not reached the necessary border of 5%, while the liberal parties, which have ruled the country up until 2 years ago, have seriously lost votes and barely jumped the 5% border. How can we explain this? One possible explanation, which is in line with Brenner's argumentation, is that the majority of voters have voted for the Progressive Party precisely because they were fed up with disastrous social politics of the previous establishment, their empty slogans, and their general loss of any credibility, while the winning party at least delivered on some of its promises, no matter how insignificant they are really in the long run, and most importantly, they had an appearance of doing something. Such examples and events can maybe serve to prove one of the important points of political struggle, that is, if the socialists don't take politics to the working classes, someone else will, that they have their own interests, which are determined by a variety of factors, and that the meaning of political struggle, besides struggling against, is also in the struggle for the working classes, to show that the socialists are the ones with the right solutions, that the socialist movement is the one to match their material interests. It's very hard to imagine this clear revolutionary moment in which, after long years of suffering and defeats, the working classes finally realized that socialists are the right choice and that they have been all along. I believe this moment never comes. On the contrary, it is the task to observe and listen to the class, but as well as to work with it, to form tight bonds among them, in order not only to correctly mobilize their interests, but also to correctly determine policy. And this is a day-to-day, month-to-month, year-to-year work in showing that only through collective strong action can those interests be realized in the long term. And we can see how the working classes acted on their own interests in the example of Venezuela. There was not much of some long-term consciousness raising or whatever, until we could observe some lack of class consciousness, speaking generally and on average. The fact is that they knew very well what's good for them and how can it be achieved. The passionate defense of Chavez's reforms in the face of the recent demonstrations speaks volumes against the thesis that people don't really know what's in their interest. Of course, this does not mean that people cannot possibly act against their interests, which happens, but in general they follow its path. Now, regarding the political struggle, the importance of interest steps in here again. As is written in the Jacobin piece, and maybe this is one of the examples how the struggle should be led. He writes, quote, the single most powerful argument in favor of unionization is the extra 20–30% that unionized workers earn in comparison to non-unionized counterparts. And then he goes on. The obvious foundation on which a mass movement for sustainability could be built is not principled concern with our responsibility to the earth, but shameful, slimy self-interest. The simple fact that if we don't act now, life on this planet is going to get shitty in a few short decades. Now, this all might seem a bit simple and vulgar, and it is simplified, but I believe it proves a point. And of course, that pro-union arguments are not just about a pay raise, but it could all be boiled down to the point that systemic change is actually simply good for people. And now finally we arrive to the question of socialism itself. What could be, actually, that is the main question, what could be the implications of a possible renewal of material interest as a basis for socialist politics? I will try to answer that question negatively at first. Actually, what are the implications of a view which does not take into account material interest? And this view is actually usually an extension of the view that speaks of false need and correspondingly demands a socialism that will abolish all of these false capitalist needs and liberate whatever it is that needs liberating in harmony with nature. There are several problems I have pointed out here. Firstly, as we know from Marx and others, for example from Lebowitz, the current given level of needs is a product of history and historical processes. It is a given set of needs and wants resulting from a long history of expansion and of production as well as consumption. This is more obvious if we take into account that people are born into a historical moment and into a class that already has its predetermined but not permanently fixed level of needs. Therefore, they cannot choose their own needs, but usually receive them during their lives according to that level. That level can actually vary in different concrete circumstances. For example, during serious economic hardships, most wants are maximally reduced and lost, so to speak, due to the fall in the standard of living, in comparison to times of great prosperity when this set of needs and wants is expanded. However, it is possible to speak of an average level of needs in a given historical period and a minimum below which it is, in normal circumstances, very hard to fall. For example, electricity or running water or such things which are considered normal. If we agree to this, this also means that going back, so to speak, in history in this sense, in the sense of reverting this level, is not possible unless there is a nuclear apocalypse, because we are accommodated to it and we know no other. It would be very hard to accept that people, at least in developed countries, can just all of a sudden go without electricity or other benefits of a more developed society. Of course, examples of the poorest regions in the world that don't have any of this tells us that yes, we can live without it if we have never lived with it. But we cannot rationally accept people to turn back time and voluntarily and easily live without these things. A society that has reached such a level can function in a normal way without these things once they are introduced on a more massive scale. And Marx speaks of this when he says that there is a historical level of needs with a certain cultural and moral element, when he says that wages can go downwards, but that they usually don't go under this level necessary for the daily upkeep of the workforce. So in a sense, it is an accumulated product of past historical processes. From this comes the second problem. The question of needs, their level and their fulfillment, Marx writes, is always a question of political struggle. In that sense, those who speak of false needs are always at liberty to arbitrarily select what false needs they don't like, and then to say this is a false need, look how grossly capitalist it is, let's abolish it. In other words, there are no coherent criteria for differentiating between false needs and true needs. Everyone gets to choose what's bad. For some it's cigarettes, for some it's alcohol, for some it's Facebook, for some it can be premarital sex, and the list can go on. For some it can be every single need that has developed during capitalism and has found its satisfaction in some commodity. It's all capitalist and needs to be done away with. The third problem is connected to this one. It always contains a normative moment, and by normative I mean ideological and political, which confirms Marx's view that this really is an object of struggle. The proponents of the false needs theory put themselves in the position to decide on what needs are false according to their own personal criteria. So it comes down to a question of decision. Who decides this? And the answer is certainly not the working classes. They cannot possibly decide since they are so corrupted. They are not ready for this decision-making process, which is a logical implication. How can they decide on what's false when they are so immersed in this false? But isn't this deeply incompatible with any kind of left politics? One of the main tenets of socialist politics is that the subordinate classes take power and involve themselves in decision-making processes. No. They should take power and involve in decision-making not in 10 years or when some elite or vanguard decides it's time, but now, today. However, this false needs theory denies them this right because of their corruption with capitalist needs. Of course, I mean, if people decide at some point in time that society should stop producing this or that, that's perfectly okay, but the point is only in it being a result of a democratic process and mass deliberation, not of an enlightened elite giving out permits on what's okay to consume and to produce. The fourth problem is an argument which also comes from the false need view. We don't need all these commodities because it is unnecessary. For example, one could say, we don't have to eat meat, it's not necessary for our normal biological functioning, we can do without it as well. Now, I mean, the point is of course not about debating about eating meat. The point is in the extrapolation we can perform here. If we don't need meat because it is not necessary, then we can also say that we don't need hot water, internet, public transport, computers, good shoes, airplanes, or whatever is not natural and necessary. But this reduction of consumption only to things which are necessary, which are in line with the natural state of humans, sounds more like some sort of Christianity politics than socialism. Isn't the point exactly in finally securing things which are necessary, not having to worry about them anymore, and furthering our development into those areas which are far from the biological or physiological state of things? Wouldn't the point of socialism be in creating conditions in which we would, as Marx wrote in relation to the shortening of the workday, cross from the realm of necessity to the realm of freedom? And Marx writes that beyond it, beyond the realm of necessity, begins that development of human energy, which is an end in itself, the true realm of freedom, which we finally begin to develop, where we finally begin to develop those aspects of our social being which are not connected to what's necessary. And as in a classical paradox, it turns out that these humanist tendencies in theory, in practice, become the most severe anti-humanism. Not only in denying the right to decide on what is to be produced or consumed, because some intellectual has come to know what is false and what is not, but also in reducing the individual to her biological needs. This is in complete opposition with the socialist project, not only because of this reduction, but also because it strives towards the reduction of consumption in general. A ominous sign of the incorrectness of such a political position can be seen in its closeness to the politics of austerity. Is it exactly not what the pro-austerity right always demands, that we cut down our spending or excessive consumption, that we have lived beyond our means, and that we need to curb our wants? Such ideological proximity between these two options should be a warning. So now we have a basic sketch of a positive, affirmative, and ultimately truly humanist socialist project, which derives its goals and principles not from the material interests of the working classes, and not from morality, historical necessity, or abstract theoretical humanism. The massive development of needs and wants by capitalism is not a problem in itself. The goal of such a socialist project would not be in discarding these, but in, as a basis, building a society in which vast amounts of the population can finally satisfy these basic and, in the end, not so basic needs. It seems like an adventure to write a political program and to say to the people, well, we know you're poor, that you struggle daily to keep your heads up or whatever, that you can satisfy anything but the most basic needs, but you know the real thing is actually in forgetting about all that. We need to fight for a society without all those things you want but cannot have. The first step would thus be a satisfaction of the most of the given needs, and then in enabling the people themselves to decide on how they would want to run the socialist society. Of course, this is not all there is to socialism, because the general rise in the quality of life, not only in the standard of living, the point would be in reorganizing production as well as consumption, but more along the lines of abolishing commodity production and all the social forms that go with it, and therefore detaching the fulfillment of needs from it, which is exactly the cause of why needs actually cannot be fully satisfied. The problem in commodity production is not that it creates more needs than it should, but that it strangles the possibility of their satisfaction. Of course, with this goal comes the abolition of all forms of oppression and domination. And this is where another basic principle of Marx comes in, that as he wrote in the Gotha program, communism or socialism, as we understand it here, is a society of abundance. Even if this abundance probably can't be reached even in the longer term, a socialist society should have this as its goal, as a constant effort to expand and deepen the possibilities for people to engage in social action via material production and operation with both material and symbolic objects, and thus with one another. I believe that the true emancipatory message of the Marxian project is in separating the distribution of goods, or the satisfaction of needs in this case, not only from the distribution of wealth, but also the distribution of skills, capacities, and capabilities, or we might say from the labor time individually expended and all things pertaining to such social forms. In other words, the point is for everyone to have more than enough goods regardless of the work. Not only would this be one of the meanings and maybe the true meaning of equality, it also represents the core of what might present the socialist option today as the right one, and what socialism is really about, making the lives of what we today call the working classes truly worth living.
Hvala Vuk. Tako kot sem napovedal, zdaj je čas, mislim, da imamo pol ure, mogoče še malo več za vprašanja in za, upam, da bo to z mikrofonom šlo, za vprašanja in za komentarje. Mislim, da je bilo veliko materijala za zelo polemično in plodovito diskusijo, tako da prosim, dvignite roko, pa bom prišel do vas z mikrofonom, karkoli, vprašanja, komentarje. Če ne bo nihče, lahko jaz začnem. I'll speak in English because my Serbian is pretty bad. Of course. So. Aha. I'll speak in English and then I'll translate. Verjetno ne razumem tako dobro v slovenščini, pa sej bom povzel na hitro, ker imam zdaj dva zelo kratka komentarja. So the first thing I wanted to say is, I don't know if you're familiar with Vivek Chiber's brilliant critique of the post-colonial theory. I don't think it can be overstated how good it is. He talks about something that is very similar to what you said, and that is that, well, the post-colonial perspective is that only culture exists. And because only culture really exists, then we can say that in the West, where there we have a bourgeois culture, that people really are, they recognize their interests and they act in accordance with them. But in India, for example, there is no such bourgeois culture. There are only communal needs, and social agents can't recognize their interests, so they can't act in the same way as we do in the West. Now, Vivek rightly rejects this culturalist argument, and he supports it with psychological and anthropological research. But what I think is important here is that we should abandon the Marxist project if we agree with the culturalist perspective. That is, if we don't resuscitate a certain conception of human nature, I would call it human nature, that is a set of some basic needs and material interests that all social agents possess across cultures and across localities, that we have to reject, that wherever there is exploitation, there is resistance, at least minimal resistance against this exploitation. So we have to reject the Marxian claim that the history of existing society is the history of class struggle. Now, and I think that what you've done is exactly that there are material interests that social agents possess, and they are able, regardless of their culture, to grasp at least minimally what are their interests when they are under attack, and then act in accordance with this. And upon this, I think these fragmentary practices of countering the resistance, I think we can build a socialist, a truly mass mobilization against capitalist exploitation. Now, the second comment, or this is more a question, is I read the Brainerd piece you mentioned, and I largely agree with what they say about why so many times, and in particular epochs, for example, in the Reagan-Thatcher era, workers have a anti-immigration xenophobic leanings. They say it's because of the fact of competition between them. And I think that's largely correct, but I would ask you if you have read something more. Is there a materialist explanation of why that goes beyond the pointing out the fact of competition between workers? Why workers are so many times of conservative leanings?
Yes, well, I would answer the first one, the second one first. It is maybe funny circumstance that that I had an argument about what you had just asked me late last night. It was actually a debate about why have it revolved around material interest. I guess somehow all of a sudden it's become a relevant topic. I've been debating it for 2 days, but the basic question was why did, if workers in Yugoslavia, for example, had material interest, why then did they seek shelter in various nationalist options? And that one of the views is it says if there are really material interests that people can follow, then that wouldn't happen. But I believe it's the contrary, and I'm not sure if this is true, but I hope that would be an answer to your question. If you look, for example, that the official communist federal establishment has actually betrayed workers. I mean, it has introduced all those measures and reforms we all know about. It would seem only logical that they have sought shelter within nationalism when nothing else would happen. And that's one of the points I try to make here, that it's like class struggle is a zero-sum game. If we don't come across and say we can do this differently, we can resist the existing establishment in different ways, someone else will, and they will blame it on immigration. And so, I mean, that would be like a provisionary answer, I mean, regarding materialist sociology, materialist explanation of such politics. So, in a sense, I mean, this may sound as a paradox and may sound blasphemous, but in a sense, they actually knew what their interest was. They recognized that the League of Communists has turned their back on them. There was no other political force, so they sought to protect what they already had. For example, some collective organizations, a given social level, against what was perceived as being threatened by the establishment. Of course, unintended consequences are a fact of politics. I mean, it always happens, but it's kind of saying that they were not right in being right. Not possibly. I'm not sure if we can say that, but it seems as if they actually knew what they did, even if though it has actually led to the privatizations and the break of Yugoslavia in the end. So I hope that's it.
Okay, še kakšno vprašanje, komentar?
To mention this, didn't the whole, the central part of your lecture, in a way, contradict or at least limit the central thesis about the importance of material interest? Because the whole point about the hypnosis theory, I think your critique was completely adequate, but then are we not precisely left with the working class that has always already followed their material interest? And still, we are not any closer to socialism for that reason. So, I mean, I just want to say that therefore there has to be some other basis, other argument for building socialism besides material interest, because if you, I don't know, maybe I'm interpreting your thesis more strongly than intended, but if you're based purely on material interests, you can, I don't think you can convince the working class individual that is the best, that joining Socialist Party or something is the best strategy for reaching this, for satisfying this material interest.
Because you think that they would have other
They would have other options, yes.
Yes,
potential options. I mean, maybe he can, yes. No, not social democracy. Can just count on, I don't know, in some of his utopic project. I mean, some of his personal genius that he will succeed on the market and become from working class, raise himself to mobility to millionaire. I mean, it's a small chance, but the chances for socialism aren't that great either. So precisely, I mean, I think what you lose with basis if you want to base socialism on material interest, what you lose is any dimension of universality. I mean, you cannot. I mean, material interest is basically. I mean, I think that's. It's not enough precisely because people have already done this. follow the material interest. And precisely because I haven't forgotten, then you need some additional argument, something historically ethical. I think you were just in the first part to truly argue for socialism.
Yes, I may have slipped a little bit into individualism here at points. I mean, it's possible, which was not the intention. But as far as I understood material interest, I mean, yes, in this paper here, it was more presented from a subjective point of view. But I believe that that's just one part of material interest. The other part is what would be interest embedded into the structural position of people. So it's not just about them being convinced that this is right or wrong. It's about what flows from there. And I mean, what you've said is, I think, that actually the key point of class struggle is how to convince people to turn people to socialism and not to look for some other individual options. But I believe that one of the key arguments there is to show that all these solutions don't work on an average more mass scale. So I mean, that's just one part of it. But I mean, I hope I answered the
yes.
I mean, it is possible.
I can understand your point in a way that what should be argument for social, for example, how should we, as a already socialist, advertise socialism? In that way, it makes. Yeah, I mean, you have to give people some promise that it won't get materially worse for them if they join the socialist project. But yeah, that's not. I wouldn't call this already the basic socialism as in the argument for. I mean, I think that you have to keep something like a universal objective perspective, which only something like this historical argument or ethical argument can provide.
No, of course, I agree. I mean, this was a more abstract examination. I believe that in concrete political circumstances, depending on where we are, when we are, and all the rest, it is not excluded that we should use other options, other principles, other demands. I mean, this is. I was actually just trying to talk about the core of what would be the point, and I believe that what demonstrates that the material interest of workers is essentially, well, yes, I can't say socialist, but that it relates to social justice. Let's say that is like the widest term we can choose. Is that at least from what I know is that no political option can mobilize workers for itself unless it addresses social problems. And that's, I mean, I didn't stress that here, maybe I should have. One of the reasons for the failure of the extreme right in the last elections in Serbia was that it really got metaphysical. It was all about territory, Russia, national identity, and it completely discarded the social moment. So the party, the radical party that once had, that was the second largest opposition party, had like 2%, and 10 years ago it had 27%. Why? Because you can see, as the years went by, they kept how should I put it? They talked about the social moment less and less, and you can basically follow it. The less they talk about it, the less votes they got. I mean, this is very simple, and I don't think it's the entire explanation, but I think it's a fact that's important that no political option can mobilize the working classes unless they, in some respect, address the social moment.
If I can also comment on what Martin said, I think you missed at least a bit the point of Vuk's lecture. His talk about material interests was not, I mean, when we say this concept helps us because it says the following. Capitalism is a society in which there are certain social structures, like class relations, which create antagonistic material interests. There is a class of exploiters and a class of the exploited. it is in material interests of the exploiters that exploitation continues. It is in the material interests of the exploited that it is stopped. Now, culture, ideology, politics, and all other elements can mask that. They can modify those material interests for certain historical reasons. Social agents will not be able to grasp their material interests, but it is the most basic Marxian claim that whenever people are exploited, they will at least minimally recognize that they are exploited, and they will act in accordance with this recognition, at least minimally. That is, they will, when the employers are trying to drive down wages or are trying to intensify work in the labor process and so on, people will recognize that it is not in their interest that this happens, so they will resist it. Now, these are small fragmentary practices of resistance which have to be ideologically, politically, culturally, and so on exaggerated. They have to be mediated in such a way as to produce mass mobilization. And here is where socialist politics, I think, comes into play. No, nothing will happen automatically. We have to develop class struggle that is ever present in its minimalist form, and we have to formulate it in a socialist direction. But I think the point of your lecture was that we don't have to rely on us purely convincing people that socialism is the best way forward, or so on. It is capitalism itself that places, and this is the basic Marxian claim in the German ideology, this capitalism, by way of its social structures that produce certain interests, itself that produce the possibility of socialism. Socialism is in a way a real possibility that is present today, because there are certain interests that point to the abolition of capitalism.